Hi, this is Professor Alexander, and this is Chapter 2. Continue the study of human sexuality. The study of human sexuality is such an important field. It has psychological, biological, um, historical, contemporary, modern implications, right? We're looking at the psychosocial aspects of human sexuality and why it's important from all the way from infancy, adolescence, young adulthood, all the way on to senior standing. So all aspects of human sexuality are important. Again, I ask for folks to take notes as I'm speaking. You are writing, right? The more better notes you take, the more you write down, the more you're able to retain that information. So we're going to go ahead and dive right into the chapter 2. Okay, so the main topics being addressed have to do with sex advice columnists, pop psychology, thinking objectively about sexuality, sex research methods, the sex researchers, contemporary research studies. Now, in terms of sex advice columnists and pop psychology, sex information slash advice genre in media transmits information and norms rather than images about sexuality to the mass audience. So note that the newspaper columns, internet sites, syndicated radio shows, magazines, and TV programs of this genre share several features. Their primary purpose is financial profit, right? Their success rests more on their ability to entertain than on any expertise. Their focus is on how to information and often morality, right? They use trappings of social science and psychiatry without the substance. So they don't have a lot of facts to back up some of the claims that they're substantiating. It's a major source of information for many college students, right? And it's also very controversial. So now, in terms of the information and advice as entertainment, the primary purpose of newspaper columnists, internet sites, syndicated radio shows, so on and so forth, is to make a profit. Like I said before, um, this is in contrast to scholarly research, which is based on findings, the actual research being done to substantiate claims, right? To make statements valid, right? Research has to be done, surveys, sometimes interviews, sometimes in-depth experimentation to find out the results. But a successful media personality rests on their ability to entertain. It's all about entertainment and sometimes even exploitment. Exploitment. So sex advice genre tends to focus on how to or morality. So the line between media, sex experts, and advice columnists is often blurred, especially on the internet, right? So to reinforce their authority, the media incorporates statistics from a study findings, but they may just throw that in there because oftentimes people pay more attention to when people say statistics say or statistics, the research informs us. Sometimes they'll just throw that in there to catch the ear and eye of folks that are paying attention for substantiated evidence. So the media may report the results of a study that are contradicted by subsequent research. Changes in the current knowledge commonly occur in behavioral research. So John Sakuluk concerns about the replicability of social science and medical research have increased. In describing social science research, the media may also oversimplify and distort the information. Thinking objectively about sexuality. Objectivity is observation of things as they exist in reality as opposed to our feelings and beliefs about them. Objectivity in the study of sexuality is not always easy to achieve. Sexuality can be the focal point of powerful emotions and moral ambivalence. Value judgments versus objectivity. Examining sex objectively can be difficult because sex has traditionally been viewed in moral terms. Value judgments. Evaluations based on moral or ethical standards rather than objective ones. They do not tell us anything about sexuality except how we ourselves feel. Value judgments imply how a person ought to behave, right? Again, we always toggle that line to how we view right and wrong, moral versus immoral, natural versus unnatural. So value judgments oftentimes cannot be empirically validated, right? There's no research done. This is kind of like an opinion. This is an opinion. It's a value judgment. Objective statements describe how people actually behave, and they can be empirically validated, measured, and tested. So when we talk about opinions, biases, and stereotypes, sexual stereotyping is often used to justify discrimination, and especially powerful in stigmatizing racial, ethnic populations, as well as the LGBTQ plus community. And again, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals. So when we refer to an opinion as an unsubstantiated belief, uh, often reflects personal values or biases. A bias is a personal lean or inclination that reflects a prejudice in favor of or against a person, group, or thing in contrast to another. Opinions, biases, and stereotypes. So common sexual stereotypes. What are some stereotypes that you may have heard throughout your lifetime, right? I know some that I have always heard is men are always ready for sex. Nice women are not interested in sex. Women need a reason for sex when men need a place. Virgins are uptight and asexual. Relationships of gay men never last, they're fleeting. Lesbian women hate men. These are all stereotypes, and we must work hard to eradicate these stereotypes and change the viewpoints. Right? So stereotypes are a type of schema, a way in which we organize knowledge in our thought processes. They help us make sense of information we receive. So with stereotypes, we see what we expect to see and ignore what we don't expect or don't want to see. Sexual stereotyping is often used to justify discrimination, right? So common fallacies, egocentric and ethnocentric thinking. A fallacy is an error in reasoning that affects our understanding of a subject. Egocentric fallacy is a mistaken belief that our own personal experience and values are generally held by others. So egocentric thinking is everybody thinks like me, right? Well, in fact, maybe nobody thinks like you, or a very low percentage, or maybe a very high percentage, right? But it's egocentric to think that every single person has your same thoughts and processes and values. So ethnocentric fallacy or ethnocentrism is a belief that our own group of culture is innately superior to others. Results when we stereotype other cultures as primitive or innocent or inferior or just not as advanced, right? So sex research methods, a scientific method by which a hypothesis is formed from impartially gathered data and tested empirically. It relies on induction, drawing a general conclusion from specific facts. Sex researchers or sexologists use the same methodology as other social scientists, but are constrained by unique ethical concerns and taboos. Methodological approaches include clinical research, survey research, observational research, and experimental research. Research concerns, the ethical issues. Ethical concerns center on the use of human beings as subjects. So informed consent is full disclosure to an individual of the purpose, potential risk, and benefits of participating in a research project. Participants have the right to withdraw without penalty, are guaranteed anonymity, and are entitled to protection from harm. Research concerns, sampling. Methodological concerns center on sampling techniques and their accuracy. So a random sample, a sample collected in an unbiased way with the selection of each member based solely on chance. Representative sample is a small group representing the larger groups in terms of age, sex, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, and so on. Bias samples, samples that are not representative of a large group, right? Research concerns on sampling. So most samples in sex research are limited. They depend on volunteers or clients, generally self-selected. Most of the research uses students whose attitudes, values, and behaviors may be very different from those of others. So some ethnic groups are generally underrepresented because these same groups are underrepresented at college and universities, right? So if you already don't have a lot of African Americans giving forth information, or Latinx communities giving information at the college, then sometimes that's representative of what happens in the whole, right? So studies of gay men, lesbian women, and bisexual and transgender individuals may be complicated by whether they have come out yet. So folks that haven't self-disclosed or haven't come out as gay, then they're not going to be the ones that are going to be offering up information, right? Because they're still closeted, is a term that we use for folks that haven't come out yet, right? So when we talk about clinical research, in-depth examination of individual or group seeking assistance with psychological or medical problems or disorders. Descriptive inferences of cause and effect cannot be drawn from this type of research. So it's a major limitation and emphasis on pathological behavior or unhealthy or diseased behavior. Survey research uses questionnaires or interviews to gather information, fast and relatively inexpensive, but usually does not allow for in-depth responses. So people may be poor reporters of their own sexual behavior. Some researchers use computers to improve interviewing techniques for sensitive topics, and the use of internet has also become popular. So daily data collection using a sexual diary or personal notes on sexual activity can increase accuracy. Observational research. Observational research is a method by which a researcher observes and makes systematic notes about behaviors without trying to manipulate them. Serious ethical issues are involved in observing sexual behavior without participants' knowledge and consent. Participant observation. The researcher participates in the behaviors she or he is studying. So this Alfred Kinsey did this. He was a participant observation. How does this affect objectivity? So what are the researcher's ethical responsibilities? If somebody participates in their own study, this can skew the results. Experimental research, systematic manipulation of individuals or the environment to learn the effects of such manipulation on behavior. The variables are aspects or factors that can be manipulated in experiments. We talk about independent variables, factors that can be manipulated or changed by the experimental. Dependent variables, factors that are likely to be affected by changes in the independent variable. Correlational studies measure two or more naturally occurring variables to determine their relationship to each other. Much experimental research on sexuality depends on measuring physiological responses. So plasmographs are devices that are attached to genitals, measure physiological response. The strain gauge, a method of penile plasmograph that measures penis circumference and volume, right? They can literally test whether or not males are getting an erection, right? So there is a famous study where self-identified heterosexual men, claimed that they had no interest in the same sex. When watching pornographic videos of the same sex, there was an arousal that took place. And the only thing that was able to measure that was the strain gauge. The vaginal plasmograph is inserted and measures the amount of blood within the vaginal walls, right? These devices do not necessarily assess sexual desire or sexual arousal. The sex researchers. Once the domain of religion and Western sexuality is now studied using a scientific framework, researchers' views have nevertheless been intertwined with the beliefs and values of their times. Three themes evident in the work of those regarded as modernists or sexual enthusiasts. Belief that sexual expression is essential to well-being. They seek to broaden the range of legitimate sexual activity, including homosexuality. Belief that female sexuality is the equal of male sexuality. So we're going to talk about some sex researchers. The first one is Krafft-Ebing. Richard von Krafft-Ebing was probably the most influential of early researchers, right? He was from Austria, Vienna. So he talked about a moral perversion, impairment of virtue and moral principles. He He also talked about a hereditary characteristic of illness is passed on to a child from his parents before it's born. In men, hair loss is hereditary, right? But he also published Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886, a collection of case histories of fetishists, sadists, masochists, and homosexuality. So he was one of the first people to use the term sadomasochism, which we're going to talk more about in future chapters. So trace variations in Victorian sexuality to hereditary taint, moral degeneracy, right? And in particular, masturbation. So that, that moral degeneracy has to do with moral perversion, which is an impairment of virtue and moral principles, right? So brought to the public attention and discussion an immense range of sexual behaviors that had never before been documented in a dispassionate, if erroneous, manner. Now, when we talk about the sex researchers Ulrich and Kurt Benny, Karl Heinrich Ulrich is a German, and he lived between 1825 and 1895. Is a German poet and political activist, developed the first scientific. He maintained that men who were attracted to other men represented a third sex, whom he called Ernies. And Ernies were born Ernies, not made, but they were born this way. They don't adapt and change to this. They were born this way. Ulrich fought for earning rights and the liberalization of sex laws, right? Where Carl Maria Kurt Benny created the terms heterosexual and homosexuality. Now, Sigmund Freud is Viennese physician. Freud explored the unknown territory of the unconscious in his attempt to understand the neurosis or psychological disorders characterized by anxiety or tension, plaguing his patients. If unconscious motives were brought to consciousness, Freud believed a person could change their behavior. He suggested that repression, a psychological mechanism that kept people from becoming aware of hidden memories and motives because they arouse guilt and prevent such knowledge, right? So he always talked about neurosis, psychological disorders, right? Spent a lot of time talking about repression and researching how childhood thoughts, ideas are linked to how we are as an adult. So Freud's work is now mostly of historical interest to mainstream sex researchers, right? But he definitely had some prominence from 1856 to 1939, right? So Freud believes sexuality begins at birth and described 5 stages in psychosexual development. So, if you've been around young infants, they go through the oral stage, anal stage, and phallic stage, right? When oral stage, everything is focused on the mouth, right? So if you're a parent or an older brother or sister, auntie, uncle, that kids at that age, they pick up things throughout the house, pennies, screws, anything on the ground, they put them in their mouth, right? Anal stage obviously is going to be focused on the anal, right? Between the ages of 1 and 3. The phallic stage is 3 to 5. So that interest kind of moves from anal to the genital. Critical in both male and female development. So boys develop sexual desire for his mother, which Freud referred to as the Oedipal complex, and fear of his father, which led to castration anxiety. Okay, look up castration, right? Girls develop desire for her father and fears of her mother, which Freud refers to as the electric complex, and develops penis envy. Latency stage, sexual impulses not active. Genital stage, at puberty, interest in sexual intercourse. So those are the psychosexual stages of development that Freud came up with: oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Havelock Ellis from England. He was an English physician and psychologist, right? and was the earliest important modern sexual theorist. He lived from 1859 to 1939. Studies in the psychology of sex consisted of case studies, autobiographies, and personal letters. Noted the relativity of sexual values, appealing to studies in animal behavior, anthropology, and history. Challenged the view that masturbation was abnormal. Documented that women possess sexual desires no less intense than those of men. Asserted that a wide range of behaviors was normal, and also reevaluated homosexuality. So before, challenged the view that masturbation was abnormal. Before that, they viewed masturbation as something that would lead to eternal damnation, that you could potentially go blind from masturbation. And Havelock Ellis changed almost everybody's viewpoint on that, right? Said masturbation is a little bit more common than we think. So Magnus Hirschfeld, right, and Evelyn Hooker. So Magnus lived from 1868 to 1935, was a leading crusader for reform, especially for homosexual rights in Germany. He himself was a gay man and possibly transgender, and his defense of homosexuality led to the popularization of the word homosexual. In Berlin in 1897, he helped found the first organization for homosexual rights. In addition, he founded the first journal devoted to the study of sexuality and the first Institute of Sex Research. Evelyn Hooker was a psychologist who lived from 1907 to 1906. She had a long life. Demonstrated that homosexuality in itself was not a psychological disorder, and that the typical gay man did not differ significantly in personality from a typical heterosexual man. Right? Alfred Kinsey, a biologist at Indiana University and America's leading authority on gall wasp, destroyed forever the belief in American sexual innocence and virtue. He accomplished this through two books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, which was published in 1953, which statistically documented the actual sexual behavior of Americans. And this happened with countless interviews, surveys, and a bunch of research. He rejected the normal abnormal dichotomy, right? And we came up with the term sexual variation. So if you look at this particular chart, Kinsey wanted to eliminate the concept of heterosexual and homosexual identities. Instead, he argued that there were only sexual behaviors on a continuum. Okay, I'm going to say that word again. Continuum of sexual expression is what Alfred Kinsey coined, continuum. In his heterosexual homosexual rating scale, individuals are rated based on other sex and or same-sex sexual behaviors and psychosexual reactions, such as sex dreams and fantasies in the person's sexual history. So this goes from 0, exclusively heterosexual with no homosexual, all the way to 6, exclusively homosexual. And he said no one falls on the 0 spectrum, right? You fall somewhere within the continuum. The sex researchers Foucault, Michael Foucault, 1926 to 1984, explored how society creates social ideas and how these ideas operate to further the established order. Foucault challenged the belief that sexuality is rooted in nature, instead arguing it is rooted in society. Now, when we talk about the sex researchers Masters and Johnson, they did a whole TV show on Showtime on Masters and Johnson, right? So William Masters lived from 1915 to 2001, joined in his research by Virginia Johnson, who started off as his assistant. And they later married and they later divorced, but they felt a systematic study of the human sexual response was necessary for treating sexual function difficulties. Human sexual response in 1966 revealed that physiological male and female sexual responses are very similar. In 1970, human sexual inadequacy revolutionized sex therapy by treating sexual problems using behavioral therapy. So behavioral approach led to an astounding increase in the rate of successful treatment of sexual problems. Emerging perspectives were feminist scholarship and feminism, a movement towards equality for women and men, and understanding the female experience in cultural and historical context, social construction of gender asymmetry, the development of social categories such as masculinity, femininity, heterosexuality, and homosexuality. The basic principles include gender is significant in all aspects of social life. Female experience of sex has been devalued. Power is a critical element in male female relationships. Ethnic and cultural diversity must be addressed. Contemporary research studies sex research continues to be an emerging field of study because information is always changing, always evolving, always adapting. Most studies are not national projects, but smaller ones dealing with special populations or issues. These are difficult times for sex research. Certain topics, even those related to HIV prevention, have been attacked by politicians and conservative groups. Funding has become more limited, right? There's not a lot of funding. People don't always want to put money into researching human sexuality. It's still considered taboo in many cultures and many areas of political life. So the number of researchers that have a passion for human sexuality is small. The National Health and Social Life Survey, NHSLS, in 1994, results remain basically the same as results of most contemporary research, with some exceptions. Americans are generally sexually exclusive. They have sex about once a week and have fairly traditional sexual behaviors. Orgasms appear to be the rule for men, but the exception for women. We got to change that. I don't like reading that. Orgasms appear to be the rule for men, but exception for women. If you are in a committed relationship and you view equality as I do, then we have to flip that, right? Everybody should be having orgasms. Extramarital sex is the exception. Homosexuality is not as prevalent as originally believed, right? So the National Survey of Family Growth in 2011, periodic survey collects data on marriage, divorce, contraception, infertility, and the health of women and infants in the United States. Sexual behavior, sexual attraction, and sexual identity report presents national estimates of several measures. Important findings include that most adults have had sexual intercourse and that men have more sexual partners, and that only a small portion of women and men self-identify as homosexual or bisexual. So, Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 2015. This is conducted biannually, measures the prevalence of 6 categories of health risk behaviors among youth. The report in 2015 provides the first national estimates of the percentage of high school students who self-identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or are not sure of their sexual identity and who have had sexual contact with only the same sex or with both sexes. The National College for Health Assessment in 2016 conducted every spring and fall, assessing students' health behaviors and their perceptions of the prevalence of these behaviors among their peers. Figure 2, percentage of undergraduate college students who reported having oral sex, vaginal sex, and anal intercourse in the past 30 days, and the percentage reporting using a condom or other protective barrier in the spring of 2019. Male represent green and the female represent purple. Take time, take notes, reflect, pause the video to look at this chart. Contemporary research studies continue. The National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior in 2010, most expansive nationally representative study of sexual and sexual health behaviors, provides a needed and valuable updated overview of American sexual behavior and reveals an increase in sexual diversity since the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior. Presents data on masturbation, oral sex, vaginal intercourse, and anal, categorized by 10 different age ranges. So data will be highlighted throughout Human Sexuality, Diversity in Contemporary America, the 11th edition. Whew, this has been a heavy chapter. All right. We were able to focus on sex advice, colonists, and pop psychology. We looked at opinions, biases, thinking objectively. We looked at different sex researchers, research methods, and we looked at the contemporary research studies. So again, as I always remind folks, look at your notes early and often, especially when you're dealing with a dense definition filled chapter, right? Go back, review notes, look at some of the notes you took, because this will give you a better understanding for tests, for quizzes, for written assignments, and it will help you retain that information. I am Professor Alexander, and I'll see you all next time.